Good evening and welcome to the Balie, where tonight we will be discussing what the Tories have been thinking. My name is Veronica Baas and I will be moderating this evening on the British Conservative Party, and we will try to figure out what they've been thinking, both in a political, strategic, maybe ideological sense, but also in a psychological sense, because sometimes for the last decade and a half, it really has looked like a drama, or perhaps a tragedy. Maybe we will discuss that as well. I am joined tonight here by a very lovely expert panel of Ben Coates, a former Tory aide and an author, by Vanessa Lamsveld, a former UK correspondent and a psychologist, and by Rob Ford, professor of political science at the University of Manchester. And so before we will delve into the question what the Tories have been thinking, we have asked Professor Ford to prepare a short talk on what the British public have been thinking of the Tories. And he will give spoilers, remain lost. Let me first introduce you properly. You, like I said, you're a professor at the University of Manchester, specialized in work on public opinion, on party politics, on electoral choice, written multiple books, award-winning books on Brexit, and also on the rise of the UKIP, the UK Independent Party. Would you take the stage?
Sure. Thank you, Veronica. I'd like to thank Veronica for inviting me to this event. And I have to say, I wish I did more of my lectures at 8:30 in the evening with all the audience having a drink in their hands. It seems like a much more pleasant and congenial way to talk about topics like this. So I'm going to just talk for 15 minutes to kind of give a little bit of background to the sort of craziness that has been unfolding in my country, and offer some thoughts on what might be driving it. So I'm going to start with there'll be a few graphs in this, by the way, because I like graphs. Does this work? Yes, it does work. Okay, so Brexit Land, sorry, that's a plug to my book. It's one of my books. It's called Brexit Land. It's very good. Not sure if it's available in bookstores here, but it should be. So the first big trend that has been very important in where we have been in the past few years in British politics, and indeed this is true in other countries as well in Europe, is educational expansion. So when the Conservatives came into office in 2010, it was actually roughly about the point when the share of people in the electorate with an undergraduate degree sort of equaled the share who have no qualifications at all for the first time ever. And over the past 10 years or so, the share of people with degrees has been steadily rising, and the share of people with the lowest level of education has been steadily falling. So bear that trend in mind when we come on to what I'm talking about in a minute. The second trend, which is evident here in the Netherlands and in many other countries too, is a very sharp increase in ethnic diversity. These are figures from the British censuses, mostly, over the past 70 years or so, and you can see that there's been a very steep rise in the ethnic minority population. In England, it's now up towards about 20%. These are UK-wide figures, which is slightly lower. A generation ago, it was about a third that, so it's a big shift in a couple of decades. The third big change is, as many of you may know, Britain has a very different party system, a very different electoral system. We have two big parties instead of lots of little parties, as you guys prefer to do here. And one of the things that has been very evident in the past generation or so is a decline in voters' attachments to those two big parties. So voters no longer felt a sense of psychological attachment to the parties. This is the sort of tribal feeling of not I vote Conservative, but I am Conservative. It's who I am. Much less of that around today than there was a few decades ago. So that's the sort of long background. Now, why did these changes matter? What produced this extraordinary period of turbulence that we've seen in the past 10 years or so? Well, the first thing is that immigration rose to the top of the political agenda in British politics. If you go back to when Tony Blair first became Prime Minister, basically nobody said immigration was an issue that they were concerned about. Then over the course of the Labour governments of the late 1990s and 2000s, it rose to about a third or 40% of people saying this is a top issue for them. And then it stayed like that all the way through to Brexit. And this is important because it mobilises those divides that I was just talking about. So you can't see this so well with the blue background, but the big green bars are the share of people who have degrees who say immigration is a good thing. And the darker bars, that's the share of people who left school at the earliest opportunity who say immigration is a good thing. It's a really big divide. And you see this across a number of other measures in terms of immigration politics as well. This is an issue that splits graduates from school leavers, it splits white voters from ethnic minorities, it splits younger voters from old voters. So it created the conditions in which polarisation could happen. And then we had the first agent of polarisation, who we'll be discussing in more depth in a minute, which is Nigel Farage. And you had, in the course of the David Cameron government, the emergence of the UK Independence Party, who went from no votes at all, more or less, to about 15% of the vote. And this in a system where those 15% voting for UKIP knew that they weren't actually going to be electing MPs because of the way the electoral system worked. So this was a kind of pure expression of rejection of the existing political system. And what is very evident is that a big part of that vote was driven by immigration attitudes. So this shows people from the most pro-immigration over on the left to the most anti-immigration, and it shows the parties they were switching to UKIP from. And essentially UKIP was picking up support from all of the other mainstream parties, and it was picking up support almost entirely amongst voters who were concerned about immigration. And that, of course, brought us to that little drama we had in Britain in 2016, the EU referendum. And there again, you saw that immigration attitudes were one of the primary predictors of how people voted. Voters who were pro-immigration were very, very Remain, 85% Remain. Voters who were very anti-immigration were 80 to 90% Leave. It was a very strong relationship indeed. Since then, that one word, Brexit, no one had heard the word Brexit before 2015. I think it was coined by journalists around about the time that Cameron suggested we would have a referendum. And then for the best part of 5 years, that was the only word you would be hearing whenever British politics was discussed all the time. It's that blue line at the top here. This is the show of people saying Brexit's the most important issue on the agenda for them. And this is 2017 through 2019. You see it dominates all the way through there. So the whole of British politics became an argument about this decision in a referendum by a narrow margin to leave the EU. And the Conservatives ended up with a large majority in Parliament, in essence, not because they won that argument. Support for leave actually fell a little bit during this period, but because they were much better at unifying one side of the Brexit divide behind their banner than the various Remain parties proved to be at unifying on their side of the barrier. Now, if we were in a proportional system in Britain like you have in the Netherlands, this pattern of voting would have produced a Remain majority in Parliament. But we don't have a proportional system, so this pattern of voting produced a large majority for a Leave-embracing Conservative Party. So without the first past the post electoral system and the two parties that it produces, it's quite likely that even with the referendum vote to leave, we would not have left in the way that we did. But of course, the world carries on. One further point. This is also coming back to the anti-immigration point. So Leave voters were very sceptical about immigration. Leave voters voted Conservative, and the voters who came most over to the Conservatives were the voters who were both Leave voting and sceptical about immigration. You saw enormous swings to the Conservatives amongst those groups, whereas amongst the groups of voters who were positive about immigration, there was actually a swing away from the Conservatives in this period. So that's how we got to a Conservative majority. This was Boris Johnson's time in office, and we'll talk about him on the roundtable as well. But of course, the sun carries on rising even after Brexit. And what has happened since? Well, you can see this line. I don't know how many of you know the name Liz Truss, but if you want to see the Liz Truss effect, that's the Liz Truss effect. Never before or since have we seen a politician so capable of cratering support for her own party and boosting support for her opponents. She was in charge just about 1 month here. Knocked about 8 points off the Conservatives' numbers in that 1 month. Extraordinary achievement. And this is where we've been in the last year or so. You'll see a very big gap between Labour and the Conservatives. So this is Brexit happens here under Boris Johnson. Then we have COVID. We have a kind of rally round the flag effect during this period. Then there was the scandals involving Boris Johnson, the Conservatives fall behind, and now this is the Sunak era when they're constantly underwater. I mean, in the context of Britain's electoral system, these numbers are akin to being the captain of the Titanic after it's hit the iceberg. It doesn't look very good. So, what else has happened? Well, those concerns about immigration that I mentioned were such a driving factor in what happened in the run-up to the EU referendum. They've largely disappeared off the agenda. The level of voter concern about immigration completely collapsed in the years after Brexit. It started to come up a little bit in recent years. There's been a big rolling controversy in British politics about small boats coming across the English Channel. One of our Prime Minister's slogans is "Stop the boats." He doesn't actually have a plan that works for stopping the boats, but he's very keen to tell us that it's a thing he wants to happen somehow. That's driven the salience of the issue up a little bit, but it's still way below what it was in that period of Nigel Farage and the run-up to the EU referendum. The other thing that's happened is that with the cost of living crisis, the Ukraine crisis, the oil crisis that we had in the last couple of years, the Conservatives' reputation for handling the economy, which has always been a big asset for them, has taken an absolute pasting. So voters no longer think that the Conservatives are doing a good job on handling the economy, and they no longer think that the Conservatives are the best party to handle the economy. So Brexit no longer matters to voters. Immigration no longer matters to voters. What matters to voters now? The economy. What do they think of the current government on the economy? They think the current government sucks. Okay, well, are there any other issues where the government could maybe try and change the subject to where they do better? No. In short, there are none. The Conservatives trail on every single issue. And when you ask people about the party image, the brand of the two parties, the Conservatives win on everything that is bad. The Conservatives are seen more as a party that's divided, out of date, extreme, whereas they're less likely to be seen as a party that understands the problems facing Britain, that is fit to government, that looks after the interests of people like me, that has a good team of leaders, is concerned about people in real need. They trail on everything that people would want in a political party and lead on everything that people would not want in a political party. And I suppose the question we will now discuss is, well, what were they thinking to end up in a mess like this, and what are they thinking about how to get out of it? This is, I guess, a conversation we'll have now. And this is the obligatory plug for my books, so please do buy them. Okay, I'll stop there.
Yes. Please join us. There? Oh, or here. It's also fine. No, it's fine. I'll ask Ben to come here to the other side. Yes, yes, please. Thank you so much. So now we have some robust figures in our head to conduct the rest of the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us as well, Ben.
Pleasure.
Was there anything that stood out to you, what you just heard?
One thing I didn't hear you mention, which I wanted to ask about perhaps, is Jeremy Corbyn's name didn't come up, unless I missed it. Because, I mean, it seems to me that's something that often gets overlooked a bit when it comes to talking about Boris Johnson's terrific electoral success. He was up against an unusually weak opponent.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I didn't, not because I don't agree with you, but because I didn't have a lot of time. I was supposed to focus on the Conservatives.
Yes.
But you're right, and it's another feature of our two-party system. It's always a dance between two leaders. Every election is. And so it matters who the other dance partner is. And particularly in 2019, Jeremy Corbyn was extremely unpopular. If you look at Boris Johnson's approval ratings, they were actually worse in the 2019 campaign than Theresa May's approval ratings had been in the 2017 campaign. Fewer voters thought Boris Johnson was a good prospect for being a Prime Minister than thought Theresa May was, and far fewer than thought David Cameron was. But the thing is, they only had a choice between two individuals. It was that individual who they were sceptical of, or this other individual who they outright absolutely didn't want to be leader. And another really critical factor there is the Corbyn effect in terms of that Leave versus Remain dynamic. So there was a really crucial slice of voters who, when they were asked, what is a worse outcome, Brexit happening or Jeremy Corbyn being Prime Minister, they said, I really don't want Brexit to happen, but Jeremy Corbyn being Prime Minister would be even worse. So I'm going to vote for the guy whose whole slogan is get Brexit done, even though I really don't want Brexit to happen, because the only alternative is, in my view, even worse.
Good one. Before we dive in right away, I will introduce you properly.
Sure.
Your name is Ben Coates. You're a journalist and author. Has written best-selling books on why the Dutch are different, is one of them, and the Rhine. But especially relevant for today. In a previous life, you worked as a political advisor, as a speechwriter in London, where you were also a Tory aide. So that must have been quite tough years after you worked as a Tory aide. Can you take us back a little to the time that you started working?
Yeah, sure.
There. What kind of time was it?
Well, I should start by saying my political career, as it were, was quite short and unsuccessful. Some of my colleagues went on to currently sitting in cabinet and in the House of Lords and things. They say all political careers end in failure. I think mine ended in failure sooner than lots of others. But the one advantage I had was I was there at an interesting time, I think. I started working with the party in Parliament in mid-2005, I guess. So this is when Michael Howard had just quite heavily lost the election to Tony Blair. And then I stayed on and off until halfway through 2010, so when David Cameron had just been elected as Prime Minister. So I was really there for that sort of Cameron ascendancy when the Tories had a strong tailwind behind them and everything seemed to be kind of moving in their direction, and David Cameron was increasingly popular month on month and so on. So it was quite an interesting period to be there during the transition, I think.
So obviously there was Labour had been in government for quite a while at that point. On what kind of grounds were they profiling themselves?
The Conservatives?
The Conservatives, yes.
Well, under Cameron, it was all about repositioning the party more to the left. At that point in 2008, say, they'd been in opposition for almost a decade, had a series of fairly right-wing leaders, William Hague, Ian Duncan Smith, Michael Howard, who had all lost elections quite heavily, campaigning on sort of traditional right-wing bread-and-butter issues. And Cameron and his team came in really looking to transform that and take a different, much more centrist or liberal line on things like climate change, gay marriage, international aid, all those sort of softer issues, to take a more liberal position. And I think it's fair to say had quite a lot of success in kind of remaking the party in that image for a while, even though it didn't necessarily stick, some of it.
Yes, and just to bring Ben's previous question back to you, was that also, that ascendancy of Cameron, was that also a failure of Labour?
Well, I mean, politics is very cyclical, and often weaknesses build up in a party's electoral coalition and its approach that aren't really evident until the fall comes. What you can see now with the kind of perspective of history is Labour were steadily weakening in their traditional heartland areas, because just as Cameron's approach was to appeal to the centre ground, that was quite consciously, kept copies of Blair's books around, I believe, an imitation of Blair's strategy from the 1990s. But in the parts of the country that ended up voting to leave and then ended up electing Conservative MPs in 2019, there was a steadily intensifying feeling of alienation from politics in that period that first manifested itself in declining turnout and then in declining partisanship. But these were people who were at that stage not willing to vote for the Conservative Party in general, and in particular not willing to vote for this David Cameron vision of middle-class, socially liberal conservatism. But there was a sort of latent demand there for something different that we first really saw burst onto the scene with UKIP. And, you know, it's a mirror image in a way to what's now happening with the Conservative Party. The problem with our system is that parties have to stretch themselves thin and they have to focus on particular target groups of voters, which inevitably means neglecting other groups of voters, which means there's a sort of inherent instability in both parties' coalitions.
I think, sorry, just briefly add to that. I think we were just talking about how Boris Johnson was quite lucky to be facing Jeremy Corbyn. I think to some extent David Cameron was quite lucky to be facing Gordon Brown as well, in that Gordon Brown was a very impressive politician and leader in lots of ways, but he had, by the time of the election that Cameron won, been one of the top 2 people in power for 13 years, been a national political figure for decades, and I think wasn't seen as very sort of likeable and relaxed, very easy to get on with. He had quite a sort of serious public image, which I think made Cameron, coming in as this fresh, relatively young face with new ideas and transforming his party and bringing new voices into the party, that made it a lot easier for him than if he'd been still up against Tony Blair, for example.
Yes. So as this voice that knows how it is inside the Tory party, can you tell us a bit, like, how does the party structure look like? So you have these MPs who have their own constituency. So does that mean they have a lot of freedom? Like, how much do they have to align to the party line? How does this work within the?
Well, as Rob mentioned, you have the first past the post system with quite a strong constituency link. So if you want to become an MP, you don't just choose a party, but you have to choose a place as well, which is quite different from the Dutch system, where pretty much anyone could start liced from forward and run for Parliament. And if they get a bit of attention, they might quite easily win a seat even. It's very different from the UK system, where the established parties have an awful lot of power in terms of choosing candidates, channeling, funneling, getting media attention. And so the barriers to entry are much higher for anyone who wants to enter the scene as a newcomer, as it were. And I mean,
so how do you get in? What is the established path?
Yeah, I guess there's probably no single easy path. The most common ones would either be work in politics professionally as an advisor to a senior member of Parliament or cabinet member, for example, and then kind of get mentored to go into an empty seat that way, or to come up through local politics and so to get a seat on your local council or your district council and build a bit of a profile locally within the party, and eventually hopefully make the step up to being an MP.
Because you can pick your constituency, right? You don't have to.
You have to live there.
Yeah,
but, I mean, you could in theory
you can move.
go almost anywhere.
Yes.
But starting a new party is almost impossible. So Nigel Farage is the classic example people always mention, who has probably been one of the most famous 3 or 5 politicians in the country for a decade. His position on lots of issues, millions of people would agree with, and yet he's never been able to get a seat in Parliament, despite trying, I think, 6 or 7 times.
Yeah, 7 times, I think.
7 times.
Yes. We'll get to him. So lastly, within you're in Parliament, you made it. So how does we hear, of course, a lot of backbenchers and front benches, and so how is the power dynamic within the party? We will get probably to that, has changed a lot over the decade, but when Cameron first came to power, so how did the backbenchers relate?
Well, it differs a bit, I think, depending on whether you're in government or out of government.
Yes.
But essentially you could divide it into, you have the leader or the prime minister and his cabinet and his advisors would be the kind of central core of power, and then the backbenchers, sort of maybe a little bit older, a little bit less diverse group who don't have power. And then the third group, which I think it's important never to forget when you talk about this kind of issue, is the party membership, which in the case of the Conservatives, you may know better than I do, Rob, I think a lot of the data is a bit unreliable, but they're generally taken to be older, whiter, richer, more based in the southeast than the average member of the population.
Yeah, and more right-wing in essentially every sense. Yeah.
And so a lot of the challenges that you read about in the press, a lot of the drama in British politics, I think, comes from the split between the fact that you have the central core of the party around the leader, the members of Parliament, and the party membership often have quite different perspectives on things like climate change and environmental legislation, and it's quite easy to identify splits between them. And then when it comes to elect a new leader, such as when Theresa May stepped down, because the base of the party is quite significantly more right-wing, that obviously gives an advantage to more right-wing candidates, so it's easier for someone like Boris Johnson to kind of come up.
Thank you. The most of the prime ministers that we will be talking about have been mentioned already, but I would like to ask Vanessa to join us as well before we go through them relatively chronologically. We can jump back and forth. Vanessa, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Let me also properly introduce you. Vanessa Lamsveld, you are a psychologist, a former journalist, has been working as a journalist for over 20 years in various capacities, presenting Eén Vandaag, for example, but also been the UK correspondent for RTL News. And in that capacity, you lived in London from 2009 to 2015. Welcome. So you just missed out on the referendum.
Yes, I remember really well. We were back for, I think, a year in Holland, or half a year. And because I left after the 2015 elections. And then I thought, then we went back. And I remember the referendum was going to be held. And the next day, when I heard that it was actually Brexit, and I still felt so British after living there felt British, but I felt so affiliated with it after 6 years. And I was standing there and at the school, and I really felt like I was dumped. I felt heartbroken. So I was really trying to share it with other parents.
It's not you, it's us.
But I do remember that I felt really emotional about it, but that a lot of Dutch people were like, they were in shock.
Yes.
So I thought, okay, the crazy Brits.
Yeah.
But for me, it felt like a divorce.
Oh. You work as a therapist now, right? So
yes, I do. So that's maybe my,
Yes. Yeah, so as a psychologist, how do you think there are so many angles you can approach politics from? And what do you think is an important way to look at the interpersonal elements of it? Yeah,
well, and indeed what you say, there's so many layers you can look at this. And over the years, I've looked at it from, a scientific perspective, from a social perspective. But it is interesting. And also when I heard you talk about Corbyn, or I don't know if you said that, about the dance between the opposition leader and the Prime Minister, it brought back to me the dance between Ed Miliband and Cameron. And that's also, of course, an interpersonal relationship going on there. And it had so many dynamics in the positions of David Cameron. What I have seen, and it's funny because over the years I did a lot of stories on on the UK. And in hindsight, there are sometimes a few of these moments that you think, that stuck. And maybe, what would have happened if it were different? And one is on an interpersonal level, was between Cameron and Rutte.
Yes.
And I think we have a picture of that.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, there was this. This was 2011.
You took the picture, right?
I took the picture a bit like this, secretly.
Very secretively.
Rutte was, you have to imagine, he was only a year prime minister. He was still really young, very inexperienced. He was on a 2-day trade tour in the UK, and we were in Birmingham there, and they were on their way back to London. And we, with journalists, were on the train in the back, but we were waiting with them for the train to arrive. And I remember so well how awkward the situation was, because it was really like two colleagues meeting each other on the platform, and that one of them thought, fuck, do I have to sit next to this guy and talk all the way? And that guy was Rutte. But it said to me at the moment, at that time as well, how the interpersonal relationship was. And why does this matter? Because, of course, as in any relationship, it's about trust. It's about, can you rely on each other? And Cameron at the time was quite isolated. And I've often thought, what if
within
their relationship...
Europe, you mean?
Sorry?
Within Europe, you mean? Yes.
Within Europe, yes. So I've often thought, what if at that moment Rutte would have been the prime minister he is now, with the authority he has now, and their relationship would have been very different. There's a lot of these small moments that I think in hindsight that have been defining as well to where we stand today.
Yes.
Quite extraordinary, really, that 5 prime ministers later, Rutte's still there.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so talking about those 5 prime ministers, were all those 5 prime ministers, can we establish some kind of baseline of how they were relating to each other in 2010? So David Cameron was
Yeah, Prime Minister.
Prime Minister.
Yeah,
Boris Johnson
newly.
was mayor.
Mayor of London.
Yes.
Not even sure he was in part. He came. Did he come back in 2010?
Who?
Because Boris Johnson was both mayor of
He was
London
mayor.
and an MP for a period.
Yeah.
Yeah, he double jobbed it for a bit though, didn't he? So I think he was an MP and mayor at that point.
Okay.
A backbench MP. I don't
Theresa
think
May was Home Secretary.
Theresa May was Home Secretary. Not a very. She was the one who came up with the pledge to bring immigration down without having any policies for bringing immigration down, which was a big part of the story.
I do remember she had a tough image. She was the tough on immigration, tough on the home, on the police.
Oh yeah. She was rhetorically very tough, but the substance didn't follow through on that, and that caused them a big problem. Gave Nigel Farage an opening. Rishi was Liz Truss in Parliament by then?
Liz Truss was probably a junior minister, I think, in Cameron's government.
Well, she was first just newly elected, and then in 2012 she entered the government for the first time.
And Rishi Sunak would have been
was
Making
in
money in
Goldman
California,
Sachs.
I think. Yeah.
He was
wasn't in Parliament yet.
assembling
He came in
his
2015 in William Hague's seat.
Yeah.
So he was off in California somewhere. Where he will be again.
Okay, but they knew each other, and it's interesting to trace how their relationship will evolve. Just before we go into the nitty gritty, so what kind of Britain did you experience when you first arrived there as a correspondent? Like, was there something that struck you?
Well, what struck me, and I mean, so I arrived in 2010, was, and it was something that was, of course, and I think you can confirm that, going on for already a long time, but austerity, big divide between North and South, that struck me a lot. I was really, I was impressed by the anti-European sentiment in some spaces. I mean, definitely not everywhere, but I remember attending UKIP assemblies, and I thought, what's going on here? But austerity and a lot of, people feeling...
It was after the crash, of course, of 2008.
Yeah, and this huge deficit, I remember. I did a lot of reporting on that, yeah.
Well, we've mentioned UKIP already quite some time. Rob, can you introduce us to Nigel Farage? How did he...
Do we have the clip?
We do. Just start with that.
Do we do the clip first?
Yes.
Yeah, let's do the clip
let's start
first,
with
because I think he should speak for himself.
Yes.
Charisma of a damp rag and the appearance of a low-grade bank clerk. And the question that I want to ask, that we're all going to ask is, who are you? I've never heard of you. Nobody in Europe had ever heard of you. I would like to ask you, President, who voted for you? And what mechanism? Oh, I know democracy is not popular with you lot. And what mechanism do the peoples of Europe have to remove you? Is this European democracy? Well, I sense though, that you're assassin of European democracy and of the European nation states. You appear to have a loathing for the very concept of the existence of nation states. Perhaps that's because you come from Belgium, which of course is pretty much a non-country. But since you took over, we've seen Greece reduced to nothing more than a protectorate. Sir, you have no legitimacy in this job at all, and I can say with confidence that I can speak on behalf of the majority of the British people in saying, we don't know you, we don't want you, and the sooner you're put out to grass,
The better.
Better.
Yes.
Yeah.
I like that clip. I like to show that clip to my students because I think it captures the kind of, both the essence of Farage as an individual politician, but also the essence of the kind of populist appeal that he built. So you had jokes in there. I think the joke about Belgium probably lands better here in the Netherlands than it does in Britain, where it probably doesn't make so much sense. You have speaking truth to power, saying out loud the things that people in these elite institutions want to be quietly silent about, because let's face it, for an awful lot of people in the European project, the Van Rompuy outcome was an embarrassment. This was not supposed to be the caliber of person they were supposed to get for this job. This was not supposed to be the mechanism whereby he got that job, the sort of traditional, completely incomprehensible backroom deal. But no one wanted to say it out loud. But the populist is the politician who does say it out loud. But there are also the ideological elements in there. Nationalism. You know, this is a project that is against the nation state and the direct appeal to the will of the public. I speak on behalf of the British people in saying, we don't want you, we don't know you. And this is a clip from 2009 or 10, I think. I forget when Van Rompuy came in. It was before UKIP really took off. But what he managed to do, Farage, in the coalition years, is essentially bring that argument that the irony of Farage and UKIP is that he honed the arguments that he deployed against the European Union in the European Union. Because he was in the European Parliament for years, because that's the only elections we had under a proportional system, so they're the only elections where he could get returned as a member. But then he brought these arguments that he had honed.
Made it even more powerful, right? Speaking truth to power.
Yeah. I mean, it provided a tremendous sort of theatre and stage for these kind. This was all for the audiences back home, and he's by no means the only populist politician who deploys the European Parliament in this way. But then he brought that to the home agenda and married it up with the issue of immigration, and that's where Theresa May becomes important, because it was her. She made a pledge. She and Cameron said, we'll reduce immigration to the tens of thousands. But and again, this is about streaking the truth that nobody wants to confront. That was never going to be possible so long as Britain remained in the European Union under the terms that it was in the European Union at that point, because of freedom of movement. Britain had proved tremendously popular to migrants from Central and Eastern Europe. Both the Conservative and Labour Party were in favour of that. They regarded it as economically beneficial, and on most metrics it was economically beneficial, but voters were increasingly restive about it. So to then say, we'll bring immigration down, knowing full well that you can't, creates the gap between rhetoric and reality that the populists can march right into, which is what Farage did.
But what I do think about that, and I'm going to put on a bit my couples therapy glasses, is that the argument it wasn't possible. We've seen, of course, later also with the Northern Ireland, the backstop, things were possible. And if I see that clip, what you can also really see, and I've talked, of course, about divorce, in a way, the dance between Europe and Britain is a typical couple fighting. You know, Europe is the party that's pulling back. You know, how to say, vermijden, avoiding, and Britain is the partner that's nagging, saying, "I want this," getting angry, not being heard, getting more angry, getting more extreme. So I do think, in that sense, that Europe really also has a role to play in this.
Well,
I know we're now tonight talking about the Conservative Party, but I do think that did add to the whole.
I completely agree. I don't want to say it as the post-Brexit Brit, dump the blame on Brussels. That's just very stereotypical. But and I think your sort of sliding doors moment about Rutte is quite sort of an example of that. David Cameron had no friends in making this argument, and there really was a dialogue of the death over this. I don't think until the EU referendum actually happened that sufficient top-level European politicians really believed it could happen. They thought this was just the usual British tantrum that would end in the usual British way, with them sulking for a while and then just agreeing to stuff. They didn't realise how serious the situation was. And I think perhaps if they had, as we've said, you know, Europe has this habit of saying, this is not possible, this is not possible, this is not possible, until suddenly it is possible.
Exactly.
So when did the Conservatives, when did they realise it was really serious? Like, when did Nigel Farage turn from this outside figure who was only elected in the European Parliament to a serious threat? Like, how did that happen?
I mean, Ben will probably have views on this as well, but from my perspective, I think it was around 2012, 2013. They started to do really well in local elections, in by-elections. They started to get double-digit figures in the polls, and everybody in the Conservative Party knew that that vote was coming more from them than it was from Labour. That was actually a misunderstanding, because often these were voters who, if UKIP weren't standing in the way, would have gone directly Conservative to Labour. So it was actually hurting Labour as well, just less directly. But then you saw Cameron starting to use much, much more hardline language about UKIP. And again, I think another area where there's a lack of understanding of Britain elsewhere in Europe is the effects of our electoral system, because it's not used anywhere in Europe. So the fact that this could split the vote and therefore really alarm a governing party, there's not really that dynamic in the same way in most European countries. So understanding why the Conservatives would feel the need to shut this out, I think it wasn't there.
Yeah, I was going to also say 2012, actually. I mean, I think sort of leading up to the 2010 election, the Tories probably viewed Farage as a bit of a joke, really. I mean, there's this long tradition of sort of right-wing populist campaigners on Europe in the UK, thinking people like Robert Kilroy-Silk in the 2000s, James Goldsmith had his referendum party in the 1990s, and they were always treated as sort of a nice, mildly amusing way for the public to let off a bit of steam by voting for them in local elections or European elections, but not something that really affects day-to-day business in Westminster. And then, as Rob said, I think that started to change, not entirely coincidentally probably, but after a couple of years of the Tories being in power, when they started to lose some popularity, started to run into the sand a bit, and then UKIP started picking up serious numbers of votes in local elections and particularly European elections. And that was when I think, as you said, Cameron sort of started talking about them as, what was it, loonies, racists and fruitcakes, I think he called them, something like that.
Fruitcakes, loonies and closet racists.
Yes, that was it, closet. There was a closet in there.
But because I do think also, because I was there when in 2013 when Cameron announced the referendum during his speech, and that was still a very
You were
bad,
at the actual...
I was there
Yeah.
in the room, as I was reporting it. I do
Yeah.
remember it was a huge shock. That wait, did he seriously say, you know, we're going to hold a referendum? But even then, Cameron was still very pro-Europe. I mean, he made in that speech very clear that his intention was to stay. So I also got the feeling that Cameron actually, not until 2015, really realized, oh, shit, I have to go through on this referendum. I think it was also a way for him in the beginning to put pressure again on Europe, say, listen, we're serious, hear us.
Yeah, and I think he'd also, by that point, the Tories had held a referendum on the reform of the voting system and a referendum on Scottish independence within a couple of years, both of which they won quite easily. And so it's probably quite natural to see a third referendum as just another, you know, it's in the can, it's an easy way to kill the issue.
There was definitely hubris about their ability to just hold and win referendums, and win round the public. Cameron had a very high opinion of himself in that regard. And actually, they should have, the closeness of the Scottish referendum, where I think the argument for staying was much stronger and the argument for leaving was much weaker, should have been a sign already that you know, this wouldn't necessarily be an easy sell.
And also what I know is that in Downing Street at the time of Scotland, the referendum, it was really a close call, and they shitted their pants 48 hours before, I heard, because they suddenly realized, oh, fuck, this can go really wrong. And at the end they managed, but in a way it gave Cameron again the sense of, oh, you know, I can pull everything. I can pull everything off.
One of my friends was working for one of the polling companies during that referendum, who produced the first poll that showed a lead for the independent side, the yes side. And on the day that poll was due to be published, he was at a wedding along with everyone else from the polling company. And he was doing the best man's speech. And halfway through the speech, all of his colleagues from the polling company all left the room and started gesticulating at him, even though he was in the middle of his speech. And so he said, well, I'm just going to have to stop now because my colleagues, there seems to be some sort of minor emergency. So he went outside and he was like, what the hell, guys? This is the middle of a speech. And they're like, they pointed at this mobile phone. They say, it's Rupert Murdoch on the phone. What are we going to tell him? That's how big it got, you know.
Ben, so before we move on to the actual referendum, this feeling of Europeanness, how was that lacking at all, or was the anti-Europeanness, did it grow, or was it mobilized by the campaigns? Or was it already there?
Yeah, I don't think it's any secret to say that Britain has always had a slightly conflicted relationship with Europe, sometimes hot, sometimes cold, sort of on again, off again girlfriend, maybe, to use your relationship metaphors. I think, there's the kind of cliched line that always makes it into articles about this stuff is that Britain lost an empire and never quite found a role afterwards. I think there's some truth in that. And in the early days, so 1970s, the UK probably saw Europe as a useful way to regain some influence and status on the world stage, and hence the referendum in 1975 on whether to join the European community went quite strongly, 65-70% in favour of joining. But then after that, Rob would know this much better than I do, but I think the polling was kind of all over the place, and there's sometimes people are pro-Europe, sometimes people are anti-Europe. Generally, there's a stronger strain of scepticism than in other European countries, I think. I remember I read last week in a report from 2014 that found across Europe, 45% of people said they were attached to the idea of Europe and to being a European member, and in Britain it was 25%, so almost half as attached, as it were. And I think there's been a lot of that going on. So it's always been this kind of complicated relationship, a bit arm's length. But I think fundamentally a lot of it just boils down to, not all, but a lot of British people struggle with the idea of seeing themselves as European. They think Europe is somewhere you go to on holiday, you get on a boat or a plane and you go to Europe. It's not somewhere that you live in, and that's partly because of geography, obviously, but that's also a bit ridiculous because they think Ireland is part of the EU and Malta and Cyprus and Corsica are definitely European, but the UK is across a stretch of water, so it's not. And I think, that's was a kind of open wound waiting for a politician to come along who could really leverage that successfully in a way that Farage did.
Yeah, I think there was also a problem with the British relationship with the EU right from the outset, from the opening 1975 referendum onwards, which is the British have always viewed and have been encouraged to view the EU-Britain relationship as an economic one. That was how Wilson sold it in 75. It was how Thatcher sold it in the 1980s. They have never been bought into or had explained to them the virtues of the political element of the project. They have always seen that as some weird business that the French and the Germans do, and why would we want to be involved with that? And it's a big mess, and it's a whole bunch of red tape, and it's straight bananas, as Boris Johnson famously said. So they just wanted it to be a trading relationship. They thought that's what they had signed up to, and so every time, at every critical phase in European integration, the response from the British voter was, well, why are you doing that now? That's not what we signed up to. And it wasn't just a failure of Cameron, it was also a failure of Major and of Wilson and of Thatcher to ever say to the British voter, this is why the political project is also a necessary and important part of this relationship. They all avoided that question.
And I think you saw that in the referendum itself, where a lot of the arguments that the Remain campaign used were quite technocratic and economic in terms of if we leave, trade will fall by X%, GDP will fall by Y%. And a lot of the arguments that people like Farage and Boris Johnson used were much more emotional about freedom and this is our Independence Day and appealing to that other side of the coin.
And the contrast with the Scottish referendum was really stark, because the No campaign in the Scottish referendum was talking about culture and history and political integration, and that this is a shared project that we have all bought into. Much more emotive, resonant, thicker arguments. It wasn't just, oh, well, it's useful to have a sterling zone and to keep customs barriers down and stuff. It was a much bigger, broader argument. And that bigger, broader argument was never put to the British public.
And still, I really think that we would not have this discussion if it hadn't come down to the austerity and to the North-South divide, what I mentioned in the beginning. Because, it's really also my experience of traveling around. I spoke to so many people about reasons why they vote in favor and against Brexit. And, well, there's one, I think we have a picture of him, Paul Green from Leeds.
It's the man...
Yeah, by the gate.
By the gate.
Yeah. But I remember so well. He lives in Leeds. Well, you can probably know that it's Labour heartland. It's a very poor area. It used to be mining area. He's standing here by a gate of a coal factory. Is that how you say it?
Mill.
Coal mine.
Yeah, coal mine.
Yeah.
Sorry for my English. which is shut, and he was desperate, really desperate. Everything in that community was shut down. There was nothing. There was no elderly care. There was no place for the youth to go to. Banks were shut. There was really nothing. And this guy, Labour man, together with his whole community, voted Brexit. And if you would talk to them, it was never about not feeling European or not what we signed up for. It was just about, we need change. Something needs to happen. And I think that that's also a crucial difference with Scotland. So, yeah.
It wasn't rhetoric, so it was desperation.
I mean, of course, it was. It didn't help, and it was. But I do think that is one of the biggest hearts of the problem. If Britain was doing well, was prosperous, then it would have been such a different debate.
Yes. Thank you. His name has been mentioned a few times, but he was very crucial in the referendum, Boris Johnson. Ben, can you introduce him for the very few people who don't know exactly who he is? What kind of politician, how did he prove himself to be?
Yeah, where to start with Boris? I think he's a lot of people would say a kind of quintessentially English character, this sort of rumpled, eccentric academic, someone who's very well-educated, very clever, very articulate, but also takes joy in the fact that they kind of come across as being chaotic and eccentric and poking fun at people. And I went to more than one event with him where he was giving a speech, and he always would carefully go off to the side and muscle up his hair as much as possible before he goes on stage, just to look deliberately scruffy.
Was he always like the golden boy, or in the party, or?
I think he definitely always had a strong base of support, certainly. I mean, he started his career, as some of you will know, as a journalist in Brussels for the Daily Telegraph, pioneered what came to be known as the Euro myths, so writing these stories about how the EU was going to ban bent bananas, or Italians were asking for smaller condoms, and all these kind of things.
Were they?
I don't think so.
Yeah, like many things Boris Johnson says, you shouldn't regard them as necessarily true.
No, just because it's in the paper doesn't mean it's true. But they were very popular with a certain audience, and they did make him famous, and he kind of leveraged that fame into a seat in Parliament in 2001, I think, and became editor of The Spectator. Then used that as a stepping stone to become Mayor of London. I think it's fair to say as Mayor he didn't have many sort of huge achievements. Bendy buses. The Olympics, which he didn't really have that much to do with.
Forest bikes.
Forest bikes, which again I think was started by a predecessor.
Yeah.
But did quite a good job of being the kind of the fun central figure, the masthead, keeping everything going. And then, yeah, as we know, he became Foreign Secretary under Theresa May. Again, not particularly distinguished, I think it's fair to say, fairly gaffe-prone, but always throughout all of this extremely popular with a certain core part of the Tory party constituency, particularly the membership, who really liked that shtick. I think it's not hard to see why, actually. You know, if you're kind of reading your Daily Telegraph over breakfast and he's the one cracking funny lines and taking a witty take on things, or if you're an MP in Shropshire who's never going to make it into cabinet, but you're arranging your constituency association Christmas dinner, and Boris comes and he's the big celebrity and gives a hilarious speech. It's not hard to see why people like that. But yeah, as has been shown, doesn't necessarily translate into good management ability when it comes to running a country.
Yes, I do think sometimes I find it quite hard to understand. Like, there is this mismatch of such serious matters, and then his persona, which was really. Was this an issue?
I mean, one of the most revealing things that was ever said to me about Boris, or at least I found it very revealing in terms of the nature of his approach to politics and how he builds his appeal, was from a Labour strategist who had been involved in the 2019 campaign, who said, if you want to understand how Boris Johnson operates, you need to be on the campaign trail with him, because people see the 30-second clip. They don't realise what goes into the 30-second clip. And he said one example that really made him think we're going to struggle against this guy was early on. He went to a bakery, Jewish bakery, selling bagels, and he was in there for 3 hours handing bagels over to people with "Get Brexit Done" written on them. Here's a bagel, ooh, wonderful bagel, have bagel, get Brexit done. And he did this for 2 hours and never deviated from his whole bumbling persona shtick, never gave the press any, because they're just looking for the one bit where it goes wrong. That then becomes the clip on the news. And that's the nature of Johnson. The chaotic image is very carefully curated and manufactured, like with the ruffling of the hair as well. It is a persona that he has built over many years because he knows in a world where politicians are not popular, to be a successful politician, paradoxically, you need to be as little like a politician as possible. But actually underneath that is an iron discipline in terms of he never breaks character. He's like a method actor in that way. And that is the nature of the guy. In some ways, ruthlessly disciplined, in terms of his own image in particular. Yeah. In terms of the substance of politics, no interest in it at all, which has been one of the big problems with him. He's very good at all of the things that get people elected. He's terribly bad at all of the things they should be doing once they are elected.
Yeah. I suspect,
sorry, that's maybe also what you say, that you feel like on one hand he's so clowny and funny, but he's dealing with serious issues. I think it's exactly what you say. He doesn't care. He doesn't have a vision on how to solve these problems, or he's a showman. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to add, a lot of politicians, I think, when they leave office and stop being Prime Minister or whatever, they feel quite lost when their power and status is gone. I wouldn't be surprised if Boris actually enjoys being an ex-Prime Minister a lot more than he enjoyed being Prime Minister, because now all he has to do is, at his own times and dates of his own choosing, fly around the world and give amusing speeches and pop up on TVs with a snappy quote criticising whatever's in the news that day, and he doesn't actually have to have any executive authority. And probably suits him much better.
I think what proves most that he doesn't really have a passion, vision, is the 2 letters he prepared before, am I going to campaign in favor of Brexit or against it? And I think that says so much, that he's not driven by, I want to change something. He's driven by, I want to be heard, I want to be seen. And how do I achieve that?
Yes. So before he could campaign for Get Brexit Done, there was this period in time where Brexit wasn't getting done, but there was desperate attempts to get this deal. So we do have a fragment from right after the second time Parliament didn't manage to get a deal. Can we start? Yes. Oh, almost there, I think.
Doesn't want to play.
It's not working. I'm sorry.
It's not working. That was exactly the problem.
Yeah. Okay. What was the problem? Not here in a technological sense, but in Parliament.
Well, the problem began in June 2017 because Theresa May had called an election because she thought she was going to get a big majority against Jeremy Corbyn, who was initially very unpopular. She then had a disastrous election campaign. It'll be a case study in how not to do an election campaign for many, many years to come, I think, in Britain, and ended up in a situation where she didn't have a majority at all in Parliament. And that is where the machine just breaks down.
So what was she thinking? Why was it so... Did she not read the country, or why was it so...
She proved to be, number one, she was relatively new into the job, so she was still having a bit of a polling honeymoon. Number two, I think Corbyn did have a very good first election campaign. A lot of his weaknesses were not really particularly exposed in that campaign, and his image as a kind of man of principle and so on, and particularly as a campaigner against austerity, came through very strongly, and he gained a lot of ground during the campaign, whereas Theresa May ended up not talking about Brexit all the time, but instead talking about taking Granny's house when she dies. This was the election that featured the what was immediately dubbed by the press the dementia tax, which was actually, ironically, a progressive reform in many respects from a Conservative party, but was framed in campaign terms as the Tories are going to come for Granny's house when she dies. This was enormously unpopular and a massive distraction from the campaign. Theresa May then abandoned it and pretended that she didn't. Did the famous press conference which went, nothing has changed, nothing has changed. Very, very bad idea to insult the intelligence of a room of journalists because they're not going to be nice to you after that. So it was a disastrous campaign, many, many reasons. But then you have a parliament with no majority in it. And that is a recipe for chaos under our system because we have a majoritarian system. I mean, in the Netherlands, a parliament with no majority in it is just parliament. That's what it always is, right? You've always got multiple parties have to negotiate stuff. That's the whole political culture. In our system, the whole culture is the government governs, the opposition opposes. And then you had a situation where there were actually a majority of MPs in Parliament who wanted to either soften Brexit or to stop Brexit. But they could not get a majority in Parliament because they could not overcome the institutional and cultural barriers to working together. So what you then had was chaos. All Parliament could say was what it didn't want, which it kept saying over and over. Don't want this, don't want that, don't want this, don't want that. What do you want then? Don't know. Not Theresa May, not her deal, not any alternatives. The kind of crescendo of it was they had a series of indicative votes, which was some sort of innovation that the Labour Party came up with, on all sorts of the different... So it's kind of like the frustrated parents saying, here's the whole menu, I'm going to run down it one after the other. Which one are you going to eat? No, 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 none of it. And it was farcical.
What I think also didn't help is that, correct me if I'm wrong, but Theresa May voted for Remain.
Mm-hmm.
So she didn't have also the credibility. If we're talking about Boris Johnson, who, you know, you don't know what he stands for and what thrives him. I mean, Theresa May voted Remain and then has to, with heart and soul, push through this Brexit deal. I mean, so that was also...
Yeah, so she was never trusted.
She was never trusted. So there was all this room for, you know, this bickering, what Rob was describing.
And then also the third complicating factor, after she didn't win that election in 2017, she had to rely on votes from the DUP in Northern Ireland, which is the staunchly unionist party, which at the exact moment when one of the key issues was how do you resolve the border issues in Northern Ireland, and she was forced to kind of wed herself with one camp on that, as it were.
Yeah.
Can you explain exactly what how many changes to the border issue were
that might
in the
take
deals?
several hours.
Yeah.
In the deals,
I'm not
but
sure
were
I'd be
they?
here all week, I think. I mean, I don't want to
Maybe
insult people how much they know already, but I mean, to put it very simply, the Good Friday Agreement effectively ended the conflict in Northern Ireland, not entirely, but quite significantly on the basis that because of EU integration, there was no longer any hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. So the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland became like the border between the Netherlands and Belgium, just changing road signs, changing the colour of the tarmac, but otherwise almost undetectable. And that meant Republicans could live in Northern Ireland, but it was almost as if they lived in the Republic of Ireland, while Unionists still could legally live in the United Kingdom. So everyone, to some extent, was happy. But then with Brexit, you have to put a border between the UK and Ireland, because it's an EU member state, and you need customs checks and all that stuff. And then, as I said, that was complicated by Theresa May having to rely on votes from one of the sides in that argument. Boris Johnson eventually sort of half untangled the knot.
Well, he did untangle it by lying to the unionists, which they haven't forgotten or forgiven. Because there were only three options. No border, which was unacceptable to Brexiteers, a border in Ireland, which was unacceptable to unionists, or a border in the North Sea, which was also unacceptable to unionists. And in the end, they went with the border in the North Sea, but pretended they hadn't.
And he kind of got away with it. I think there's a bit of Nixon goes to China there because he had such strong credentials as a Brexiteer and a unionist. He could get away with that in a way that Theresa May probably wouldn't have been able to. But then it's subsequently fallen to Rishi Sunak to sort of re-untie the knot or tidy up things further. With this rather complicated arrangement of different categories of goods going into Northern Ireland get checked in different ways, depending on what the final destination is.
This also, I think, is an example of what you were talking about earlier in terms of the EU not really engaging with like the problems that exist in British politics until it's almost too late. Yeah. Because I remember seeing how the Europeans were talking about the Northern Ireland issue and thinking, you really don't seem to get how difficult and explosive this is. Yeah. You know, I mean, what are we talking about here? Like, you know, a few tons of pork might make it to Dublin that's come without the right veterinary checks. I mean, who cares? Yeah. This is a peace process on the line versus a few tons of pork. And no, the EU were like, no, the few tons of pork, everything must hinge on this. And I just thought sometimes it was farcical how obstinate they were being about that.
I also think on the Tory side or on the Westminster side, there's also probably not enough interest in the seriousness of it and not enough interest in Northern Irish politics genuinely, at least until it was too late. Sort of belatedly, I think everyone realised that it was very important. But
well, the irony is that Theresa May really did take those concerns seriously and actually got out of the EU a massive concession that was what the unionists wanted, but they didn't trust her, so they rejected it. And then Boris Johnson, who had zero interest in the concerns of Northern Ireland, chucked them under the bus and they celebrated.
So Boris gets Brexit done, and then he still kind of messes up, I would say.
That's one way of putting it. Diplomatic.
Diplomatic. So, just we will be going to Liz Truss very briefly, as was her prime ministership, of course. But we do have to mention like the whole Partygate scandals for a little bit. And just to remain with the theme of the evening, do we think that there was anything particularly here from an outside perspective? It really did look like the image of the elite that wasn't concerned with the people, and that also tied in with all our images here about the class system in Britain. That really played a very big role in the government not abiding its own rules that it set on COVID, which were very strict. Do we think we can say something like that, or do we really have to bring this down on his personality?
Well, I think if you'd have written, say, an episode of The Crown in which a Conservative Prime Minister who had been elected by a bunch of voters who were fed up with out-of-touch political elites, and featured an episode where the advisors have said the politician partied all night in the middle of a COVID lockdown, including being sick on the photocopier and in the bin, the day before the Queen sat alone in a pew at the funeral of her dead husband, they would have said, well, that's way too on the nose. That's definitely not something that's remotely credible or realistic. No one would be that stupid. That is what we actually had as reality. Yeah. It epitomised everything that's wrong with Boris Johnson as a politician, really. He just didn't care. It never seemed to have dawned, and you know, he set the tone and the culture which led to all of this happening. It really, even now, does not seem to be to dawn on him how deeply, deeply angry this made everybody. Everyone had endured enormous sacrifices. And then he was like, oh, well, you know, we had to have a few glasses of wine to jolly people up in number 10. I mean, for God's sake, people were having parents and children and spouses dying and not being able to see them. And this guy's like, well, you know, it's important that everyone be able to have a bit of a party to, you know, get the morale up. So the anger was entirely understandable. And no, you know, this is the Boris uniqueness. No other politician would have been so stupid and so selfish and so daft. No one in the whole Conservative Party, I think, would have made such a basic blunder as that.
Yeah. Because even though Cameron is, of course, also what you said, part of the elite, I fully agree. He would not have done this. This is Boris. Boris in
his legacy.
Blown.
It's interesting to compare to the Netherlands situation, because I think for me, at least, maybe for some other people, it's kind of hard to relate to, because in the Netherlands, the lockdowns were never really that strict in the way that they were in the UK of, you know, you can't go for a walk in the park and that kind of thing was never on the table here, really. I remember
we had police helicopters descending on people because they were out walking and they were too far from home.
Well, we had the minister hugging his mother-in-law
Yeah,
Right.
Fred Grafferhuis got married and had his wedding party
That was
during
not a
lockdown.
scandal, but if we compare it to Boris,
Was
I
it
think it
Amalia,
got
I
away.
think, had a birthday party during lockdown as well. So there were these lockdown breaches, but it wasn't, I don't know, I think because the lockdown was less strict, it didn't feel like such a big moral breach in the way that it did in the UK.
I mean, it was because I think if it had been one party of that kind, like Hands Around, or even like the one that they showed with people in the garden and stuff, it wouldn't have been. It would have been survivable. It was the fact that they were endless. Every single day you turn the news on and it's like another lockdown party has been uncovered, and each time it really was like a soap opera, you know. And you just think, well, the day before the Queen's, I mean. No one in the office thought this might be a bad idea to do a party the day before the funeral of the Queen's husband, and that was the kind of culmination of it. And this was definitely, incidentally, great work by the media, both broadcast and print, because they had all of these stories for a while and they staggered them out, knowing that, you know, they keep the worst ones right to the end, and it destroyed the Johnson administration.
And it led to a party, a leadership election within the party between Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. Ben, Rishi Sunak, he lost initially.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of man was he? What basis was he running? Like what?
Yeah, I find it a very difficult question to answer, actually. I think I always find Rishi Sunak quite difficult to categorise because, I mean, on the one hand, he instinctively comes across as being quite a kind of liberal, centrist, technocratic, laid-back guy. If you look at his background, he's the youngest prime minister in modern history in Britain. He had a relatively normal upbringing in Southampton, working in Curry House on the weekends, supporting Southampton football team. And he doesn't come across as a sort of elitist in the way that, say, David Cameron did. But then on the other hand, I mean, he's former Goldman Sachs banker, former hedge fund owner, fabulously wealthy. I read yesterday him and his wife together are worth £700 million, and King Charles is worth 350 million. So if you're twice as rich as the king, you're probably doing something right.
Well, he married up as well.
Yeah, that's true. I think he's kind of difficult to categorise on that front, and you see that I think in some of the challenges he has at the moment is the party and he himself seem to struggle with how to pitch him. Is he the change candidate? Is he a technocratic centrist? Is he a true blue royalist continuing the tradition of Truss and Johnson? I think he's still a bit of an enigma, really.
Yeah, and he lost out to Liz Truss, but he had the last laugh. Vanessa, who was she? Like,
Yeah, lettuce, right?
Oh,
I don't know if everyone knows.
Yeah,
Oh, you got to tell the lettuce
Yes,
story.
you have
It's
to
the
tell.
best
Yeah,
thing
well,
ever.
the lettuce. She lasted 45 days, and at some point, it was the
The Daily Star.
The Daily Star. I'm just curious, who doesn't know this story? Can I see?
Do you know about the lettuce?
Yeah.
Oh, you don't? Oh, okay.
yeah.
No, so the Daily Star, tabloid paper, at some point said, well, she's not going to last longer than a lettuce.
Actually, The Economist ran a column where they said she would be outlasted by a lettuce.
Oh,
and then
okay,
the Daily
that was
Star
the-
basically got a lettuce and put it in a dress, and it had goggly eyes.
Yeah, and put it next to it, and they filmed
British
it.
And they
Journalism
filmed
at its
it.
finest.
You could watch it
There
in
was
real
a lettuce,
time. Yeah.
lettuce cam that you could watch, and picture next to it with Liz Truss, and a wig on, a blonde wig, and the lettuce won.
Yeah,
So,
on the day when she resigned, the Daily Star's cover was just a full-page picture of the lettuce done up with a little bottle of champagne, and it said "Lettuce rejoice."
and they projected a huge lettuce on Westminster to the lettuce has entered Parliament. So yeah, that was Liz Truss in a nutshell.
Why was she such a disaster? Like, what was
How long have you got?
less than 45 days?
Well, I've actually said it a number of times. Like, I mean, at the time, it was just like, what on earth? But I mean, like, first of all, let's say how she felt, and then why she was a disaster. The how is she did this, what was farcically called a mini budget. in which she announced that they were going to slash all of the taxes on everything, and deficits would take care of themselves. It was kind of like turbo Reaganism.
It was 50 billion or something.
And it was a huge
amount.
hole that it would blow in the budget. And I remember I got a text, because I was teaching that day, I got a text from a journalist saying, did you know what they just said in the mini-budget? And I was like, no, I've not been watching it. And she put all the... And I was like, this is not going to end well. And it was the next day, the stock market crashed, the bond market crashed, everything crashed. And then her approval ratings crashed as well. And this is actually where, from the perspective of a bit further out, I find the whole Liz Truss episode actually quite encouraging. Because in the space of just a few weeks, the entire British public that had been so polarised for so many years came together around one thing, which is that Liz Truss is a terrible politician and should be out of office as quickly as possible. 85% came to that view. The approval rating charts from the opinion pulses are amazing. They're like a vertical cliff.
But it didn't unify the country for a long time.
No, it didn't for long, but it's important because someone like Donald Trump, for example, who was literally telling people to inject themselves with bleach in the middle of COVID, his approval never dropped below 40% because the power of tribe is so strong there in America now that it's like a kind of reality distortion field. Whereas what this showed is if someone is sufficiently obviously bad at being a politician, in Britain, that overrides the tribal power, even after all of this Brexit.
But you still wonder why that only came out with Truss, because...
But she was uniquely terrible.
Yeah, but she also got elected. And what does it say about the party that she managed to get? I mean, she she wasn't voted in by the populace, but she was by her party. So what were they seeing in her? Or by the members of the...
Well, I mean, if you were to put up a Persian cat and announce that it was a very right-wing Thatcherite Persian cat, it would beat any moderate Conservative amongst the Conservative membership because they will just vote for the candidate that they perceive to be the more right-wing. And this was one of the other ironies of the race. Rishi Sunak actually a dyed-in-the-wool Brexiteer, Thatcherite, tax cutter. He was perceived as a moderate and, sort of Remainy. Whereas Liz Truss literally was a Liberal Democrat before becoming a Conservative and voted for Remain, but she was perceived as a hardcore Brexiteer. And whoever gets perceived as the hardcore right-winger in a membership contest for the Conservative Party wins. It's as simple as that. The members are very right-wing, and they get two choices. They just vote for the more right-wing one. They always have. Every contest they've been given.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Plus, Rishi Sunak had helped knife Boris Johnson and bring about his downfall, which is never a good way to endear yourself to the Tory masses.
There was a big traitor thing. A lot of them were saying, "Oh, he's a traitor. You can't trust him." Boris had raised him up and stabbed him in the back. It's true.
Yes. Well, to close, Sunak also brought back David Cameron this week. That was kind of surprising.
Yeah.
What was your first thought?
Surprise. Yeah, I have to say I don't really get it, to be honest. I mean, I can certainly see that there's plus sides for Sunak in bringing back Cameron. Distracts from sacking Suella Braverman. Cameron has a lot of stature and experience on the world stage. He's a good media performer. There's certainly reasons you could do it, but I think, well, Sunak, 3-4 weeks ago, was giving his party conference speech where he was condemning the last 30 years of elites who've been mismanaging Britain, and then practically the first thing he does after that is appoint this ultimate face of the failed political elite, David Cameron, to come and be his right-hand man. I don't really see it. I presume there are some centrist Tory voters who would be more likely to vote for the Conservatives now that Cameron's back, but I wouldn't think that's a huge number, and I think it's probably a much smaller number than the number who wouldn't vote for them now that Suella Braverman has been sacked.
And she's the very right-wing former Home Secretary.
And there are ways, I think, that Sunak could have sacked her and replaced her with someone a bit more right-wing. It's kind of in between Cameron and Braverman on the spectrum, so to speak. Someone like Kemi Badenoch or bring William Hague back, perhaps. But he chose not to do that. What the electoral strategy is for the Conservatives at this point, I have no idea, really. It seems to veer around from day to day. One day, Sunak sounds like Ken Clarke, and the next day he sounds like Michael Farage. It's very difficult to figure out. Michael Farage? No, just Farage. But it's very difficult to figure out.
Yes.
I really was... I thought, wow. I was also a bit angry, but I thought this is a Wopke Hoekstra action, actually. You know, you can be so terrible on your foreign policy, and the shamelessness of returning to office. And I was just thinking, looking at those 5 faces, you know, who do I think, left Britain worst off? And I really do think it's Cameron, because he started this.
Yeah. I like this as a last poll. Who do you think?
There's a clip, a very viral clip from an EastEnders actor called Danny Dyer, who's actually distantly related to the monarchy, because they did a Who Do You Think You Are episode, that kind of sums up the problem that the Conservatives have with Cameron, which is, I mean, he basically does this thing, like he gets asked about Brexit, and he says, nobody knows what Brexit is. Nobody knows. It's an enigma. And what happened to that David Cameron? He's there with his trotters up in Nice. He just ran off, left us all to deal with this mess. Twat. And he says the twat bit like about 10 seconds after, like when someone else is talking, and he's just so angry, it looks like he's about to march off stage. And I think the risk for the Conservatives is that kind of anger about Cameron blowing everything up and then walking away is still latent there. In terms of why I think they've done it, I think it has dawned on the Conservatives that that light in the sky might be a meteorite coming to wipe them out. Those polls, when you have our electoral system, are extinction-level event polls. If the election next year looks like that polling, they could go down.
And decide when to hold the election within the next year, right?
In the next year, if the voting looks like that polling, they could go down below 100 seats, below 70 seats, below 50 seats. You know, the floor is the limit, really. The Canada 1993 gets cited a lot, which is when the governing Conservative Party went from having a majority to having 2 seats. First past the post can be brutal if you go below a certain level. There is no floor, particularly if your vote is evenly spread, as the Conservatives is. So I think this is an aspect of panic. There's been a long argument in the Conservatives about whether they should focus on trying to hold on to the Leave, Red Wall type places that they won from Labour, or their traditional sort of southeast heartlands. And I think they've decided the Red Wall is gone, the economy's tanked, everyone hates us up there now, we've got nothing to tell them. So let's try and bring back that kind of warm 2010 vibe for the home counties people who are not so exposed to the financial crisis by bringing back the guy that they liked. The problem is that that's all premised on everyone forgetting the circumstances under which that guy left, and I'm not really sure that they will.
And it's quite inconsistent, I think, to be trying to do that at the same time as you're very loudly saying you're going to deport people to Rwanda, and slowing down environmental legislation and opening new oil rig licenses in the North Sea. And there doesn't seem to be any consistency. I think you could make a reasonable case for a kind of modernising Liberal election campaign, trying to rejuvenate the Cameron coalition, or for a right-wing campaign trying to kind of repeat what Boris Johnson did 4 years ago, but it seems to me like they're just trying to have both at once and ending up in a complete mess.
Exactly.
So just repeating Vanessa's question, who is your least favourite Tory of the 5?
Of the 5 up there? It has to be Truss, I think.
Okay. And you?
Well, like I said, I think Liz Truss is the worst of them, but she didn't have enough time to do much damage. I kind of have a grudging respect for Theresa May, because she was like Sisyphus trying to push the boulder up the hill all the way through that process. I think Johnson is a horrible human being, but an effective politician. And I do agree, I think in many respects, Cameron's kind of insouciant, laid-back, failure to really consider the gravity of what he was doing, and then his immediate decision to just saunter off and leave it for other people to solve, including leaving Parliament, probably makes him the worst of the 5.
So that means that now you have the best. That's kind of an optimist note to end this conversation. So that was
Oh no, I don't think he's a very good politician. He's a bad politician and not a very effective technocrat for the reasons that we've been talking about. He's like a drunk skier veering all over the slope, and it's very incoherent.
not that positive of a note to end on then. I will be having a few minutes for questions from the audience. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question? Wait, I'm looking for a microphone.
What's your opinion about the role that the United States has played in shaping the policies of the Conservative Party? I think there's an interesting opinion that the UK politicians feel closer to the US because of there being no language barrier, whereas they should feel a lot closer in spirit to Europe because of geography and the size of the trade, right, and things like that. So what's your take?
Is there anyone specific you're asking the question to? The panel. Ben.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm not sure I have a very good answer to it, really. I think you're right that Britain does feel often emotionally sort of closer to the United States than to Europe, probably significantly because of language. As you said, someone pointed out to me last week, actually, that Brits always say across the pond to mean the Atlantic, when that's actually quite a bit bigger than a pond, but then talk about the Channel quite often as if it's this really vast gulf between Britain and Europe. In terms of how that affects the politics, yeah, I do think a lot of Conservative Party politicians have quite good links in the US and are quite proud of the fact that they get invited to go and lecture at some think tank in Idaho or whatever every summer. A lot of them have you also get quite a lot of, or not a lot, but a reasonable number of young American political activists come to the UK to get involved and volunteer and so on. So I think there's that kind of tradition there. And then there's the Thatcher-Reagan thing, which we've alluded to a couple of times already. But I think Reagan, to a lesser extent than Thatcher, but still cast this kind of long shadow of being, well, Truss done well, I guess. The way that you can have supply-side economics delivered in a reasonably effective way. So I think a lot of people look on that in a very positive way.
Yeah, and I do think you see a difference in Republican and Democratic presidents, because when Trump and Johnson were, of course, very close. But Obama was quite critical of the whole Brexit period. So and Biden too, with the Northern Ireland issue. So I think it does differ a bit who is handling the steering wheel in the US.
Yeah, that's good, and probably also in the UK actually. So I think the Labour Party is probably a little bit less pro-American, historically a bit more sceptical of NATO. Not Blair is probably the exception, but these days I think you'd probably be more likely to see a shadow cabinet member going to Copenhagen to meet with ministers or give a presentation than they would be to go to Washington.
I think the other thing I would say about the UK-US link is that some of the odder things that have been happening in British politics recently reflect a tendency, actually you see it in both parties, but you see it a lot in the Conservatives right now, to import ideas from the US and underestimate the difference in context. So we've had a number of socially conservative activist conferences in the UK recently where they've tried to bang the same kind of culture war drums as you bang in the US. And the US is a much more deeply divided culture, a much more religious society, a society where a number of issues that have been settled in Britain for a long time are still absolutely live. And so this stuff just comes across as like comically out of touch, and it really falls flat as a result. And the Truss farce was actually another example of this, because Truss and Kwarteng really believed that kind of tax cuts pay for themselves thing would work in exactly the same way in Britain as it had worked in the US. Failing to realize that the US is the world's largest economy, it's the reserve currency, people will always want to buy dollars and treasury bills, come what may, so you could do that and say tomorrow will pay for itself, it's somebody else's problem. Whereas in Britain, which is a medium-sized economy with a very open financial system, all that you were going to do was trigger an enormous financial crisis, which is what immediately happened. So it's that thinking that, we should just copy what America does without thinking, but we're not the same, so it won't work in the same way. You see this very often, I think, in British politics, actually.
Another question.
Well, the Dutch people that follow politics, I think, generally laugh at the UK because, not to be arrogant or anything, you don't have enough seats for your MPs, no limited amount of lords you can have, etc. But is there anything we can learn in the Netherlands politically from the UK?
Good question. I mean, I think I'm generally a fan of the Dutch system. I don't think you could argue that the British system has performed better than the Dutch one in the last 10 years. But there's one thing that I do notice. To me, the relationship between the Dutch voter and the state, as it were, often seems quite weak, in the sense that people go into elections expecting that whatever a politician promises to them won't be delivered, but it will just be the starting point for a negotiation. I read a study once that said British political parties usually deliver about 90% of their manifesto once they get into power, and in the Netherlands it was something like 55%. And I told that to a Dutch friend, actually. He said, wow, 55%, that's good.
Yeah.
And I, in many ways, that's a kind of inevitable outcome of the Dutch system that you probably can't do that much to change, but I sometimes wish that politicians were held a bit more strongly to account. And in a similar vein, I think one thing we haven't discussed tonight really is the media culture in the UK, which I think has played a huge role in kind of promoting Euroscepticism, disillusionment with politicians, the rise of non-mainstream parties and so on. In the Netherlands, you have that much less. I mean, there are, you have the Telegraaf or whatever is more Eurosceptic and more takes a more strident tone, but you don't have a really campaigning press. On the whole, that's a very good thing, probably, because you don't have it kind of polluting the atmosphere in the way that it does in the UK. But again, I sometimes feel like if you were a corrupt or completely incompetent politician, it's maybe easier to get away with that in the Netherlands than in some other countries, because the level of scrutiny is just not so high and people are a bit more trusting.
And it's interesting, this question reminds me when I just moved to the UK in 2009, and I was sharing an office with other people and also British people. And we were talking about, because the elections were coming up and it was looking like it was going to be a hung parliament, which it ended up to be then, between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives. And I remember he was like, oh, this is horrible. This is terrible, a hung parliament. And I said, well, I can reassure you, we always have hung parliaments and it's fine, And he said, no. I mean, for you, you're a really small country, it's fine. No, it's not fine. You cannot make decisions. We need this, this two-party system where you also showed. So I don't know if, I wonder what you ask, if that's still perceived in Britain.
Well, I mean, I'd like to answer this question, but I'll answer that question after. I mean, what lessons would I take from Britain in recent years for the Netherlands? I think there's two I would take. The first is, don't underestimate the dangers that can come from people believing that the political system is out of touch with them and unresponsive to them. And that 55% manifesto's pledge illustrates how that could become a problem in the Netherlands through a different channel to in Britain. So in Britain, it was very often all these safe seats that we have under our system. So people, it doesn't matter what I do, I get the same MP anyway. I think in the Netherlands, it would be, it doesn't matter what I do, I get Mark Rutte. We have an election campaign, everyone argues for a while, and then Mark Rutte wins, or whoever will be the next Rutte. And there is a very powerful sentiment in the public, which our system is actually good at channeling, which is the desire to chuck people out. Sometimes politics is not about what people propose to do, it's about wanting to just be, to have change and catharsis. We're fed up, we want somebody to pay for it, we want somebody to fire, and our system is actually good at that. And indeed, we should have realised that before having a referendum, because that was how people treated it, as another mechanism, another lever to pull for change, as you put it very well. And that would be my other piece of advice. Don't have a referendum on anything, ever. Very bad idea.
If I can add to that, what I like in the British system is the constituencies, that you have a certain person in your constituency who holds surgeries. It's an actual person you can walk into and say, hey, I'm worried about this. What are you going to do about it? And now the bridge to The Hague is huge. I mean, you have not a direct talking point. I think that's something that's really good in the British system.
Yeah, and people really, really like that.
Yeah.
And whenever the issue of electoral reform comes up, it's the number one objection is always, but we need to keep the constituency link.
Yeah.
And of course, there are ways of doing it. There are mixed systems, I suppose. But it's kind of revealing because the British are normally very negative about everything about their politics. But they say, oh, the constituency link is good. If I have a problem, I can go and see my MP. He'll help. And it produces this weird phenomenon where if you say, what do you think of MPs in general? People hate them. What about your local MP? Oh, well, he's different or she's different. She's great.
Yeah.
She helped me with this problem I had with my landlord or whatever it is. You know, people really like that stuff.
Yeah.
It's very valuable.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Ben Coates, Vanessa Lamsveld, and Rob Ford. Thank you for watching. If you have watched at home, and the audience, I'd like to ask you to come with us to the cafe and talk a bit about politics. Thanks a lot, and a warm applause for the panel.